So hello everyone and welcome to another episode of Spring Pro 1000's The Verdict. I am Spring Pro 1000 and today we're going to talk about Crash Bandicoot 4 It's About Time, which is the latest in a long running Crash Bandicoot series. This one of course being developed by Toys for Bob as opposed to Naughty Dog, who are most famous for developing the original trilogy. And as Toys for Bob has kind of been doing more or less since the inception of the series, since the inception of all their remakes, from the Insane trilogy to the Spyro Reignited trilogy. This time around, they're not just flat out remaking an old game, but rather making something completely new, and in my opinion, completely fresh. And I have to give them credit for it because, in all honesty, it's a hard legacy to live up to, given that Crash Bandicoot is such a classic platformer with a lot to live up to in general, because Crash Bandicoot has a lot of gameplay elements to it. Now, Crash is kind of a very simplistic platformer. As Crash Bandicoot, you can use your spin attack to defeat enemies that are close to you. You can jump and land on enemies similar to Mario and other platformers. And other than that, Crash also has a couple other moves like sliding, or he can pull out a bazooka in one game, and he can maybe spin multiple times back to back. So there's a lot of different things that Crash can do. This game more or less returns most of that, but it also adds in a couple of new gameplay elements. It adds in the ability to play as up to 3 other types of characters, between Tawna, Dingodile, and N-Cortex as unique characters with their own levels, their own sections in their levels, as well as probably the most iconic part of the game, which is the Quantum Masks. Now, the Quantum Masks are similar to Aku Aku, except unlike Aku Aku, who just is there to be extra hit points instead of you just dying outright on 1 or 2 hits, the masks can basically give you different powers and abilities. So that, for instance, there's the ability to slow time, there's the ability to phase objects in and out of existence, there's the ability to invert gravity, and lastly there's the ability to use dark matter to augment your spin, so you hover more and you can break harder to hit objects as well as harder to break enemies. And it's kind of cool to see that they're trying to mix up the formula, specifically in a franchise that's been around so long. I think that comparing it to, say, like Warped, which added like new different kinds of challenges and enemies and levels, I think that they made the right choice by getting rid of things like speedway levels, which are just driving levels for the most part, and focusing more on what Crash is about, which is the platforming and the difficulty. Now, the one thing I will say is that this, unlike, say, the Spyro sequels, which generally added stuff like elements, which felt very out of place and awkward, given that, Spyro's sequels were pretty much glitchy and messy. I'm talking about after the original trilogy, of course. The masks feel like they actually add something to the core of the franchise, which is the platforming, which a lot of which is very punishing, very difficult, very forgiving. Now, the gameplay of this game, like I said, is pretty much simple. There's a couple new things like wall running, and like I said, the masks will show up at different points and levels, and you're supposed to use their powers to help you overcome whatever gets in your way. You traverse an overworld map, you select a level, you get into the level. It's the usual stuff of breaking as many boxes as you can, which gives you rewards. There's time trials. And what this game does is something that I actually liked in a previous game that I probably did a verdict on, which was Yoshi's Crafted World, which is when you complete a level, you have the ability to go back and redo the level in an alternate way. So in Yoshi's Crafted World, it was playing the level in reverse, which has different effects and different things happening. It's also kind of a time trial of sorts. In this game, they have something called inverted mode, which basically mixes up and changes different elements about the level. It also works for boss fights. Pretty much every level is playable under it, and in my opinion, that's really good. When you have a platformer, you generally don't want your platformer to be super short. It was cool for them to be super short maybe back in the 90s, when things were just a little bit more cut and dry, when you could get away with selling games that were pretty simplistic just because they were new and pushing the genre forward at the time. But I think that it's the right step forward for platformers to have basically every level have like an alternate harder mode, and I actually kind of really do appreciate that. I think it adds to the replayability. Additionally, having different characters be playable is also pretty cool. Each one plays a little bit differently. For Tawna, you're a little more agile, and you could use a grappling hook to lash yourself across gaps and to defeat enemies. For Dingodile, you use his vacuum pack to suck up boxes, which you could then shoot out at enemies and do puzzles using hovering. And lastly, for Cortex, you basically shoot enemies to either turn them into stone or to bouncy pads, and you have a forward air dash that you could use, which is really kind of cool. And I think that ultimately lends itself for this game to be very, very enjoyable gameplay-wise. Now, the one thing I will say is that this game is cripplingly difficult. This game is very, very challenging. It's very, very hard, and you are going to have one hell of a time if you really, really want to start looking into collecting all the collectibles. If you just want to beat the game isn't too hard. It's challenging from start to finish for sure. But would I say it's super difficult and you'd really struggle to beat it? Probably not if you're familiar with most platformers and if you're really used to this style of game. But on the flip side of it, what would I say about the rest of it? I would say that the game is probably going to challenge you pretty hard if you want to get anything more than just basic completion. And just from the couple of levels that I was able to get all the boxes on, I can tell you it is way harder. And you can definitely miss stuff compared to like Crash 3, which in my opinion was challenging but okay at points. It wasn't too crazy. Probably was the easiest of the original trilogy. It's the one I'm the most familiar with because it's the one I had when I was really young. So the story of this game is pretty straightforward. They ignore the original fourth title, which was The Wrath of Cortex, and any titles after that. Instead, what we get is a direct sequel to Crash Bandicoot Warped. So Uka Uka helps Neo Cortex and Nefarious, or rather Entropy, get out of their prison, which they've been stuck in since the end of Crash 3. They are able to escape, and basically the hole that they are escaping from opens up a rift that leads to the multiverse, where they want to conquer all the dimensions that exist. And so to do that, they re-recruit N-Gin and Embryo, and Embryo, I don't know where he's been for the last couple of games. He might have been in Crash 2, but he wasn't in Crash 3 because they had Tiny and Dingodile in that game as villains. But they recruit basically all of them to show up and help out. Each one of them serves sort of as a boss for a different world, which is kind of cool. And from there, Aku Aku is able to sense the disturbances and tells Crash. Crash basically goes out on another adventure, and this time you can play as Coco whenever you want. Crash and Coco more or less play the same. They have the same costumes. It's really just up to you who you want to play as. It's a nice touch that they've had since, I think the Insane Trilogy lets you do this. And from there, you go out, you find the ancient witch masks that allow you to do all the different gameplay elements. And there's twists and turns in this. It's not as straightforward as just defeat in Cortex again, which would have been kind of boring. And I think there's a good amount of cool stuff in it. Now, there's also some throwbacks to the original games. There's VHS tapes which you could use to play old school style levels, which are very difficult. Like I said, if you like platformers and if you like a lot of content for your platforming, I think that this game really hits the nail on it. It looks good, it plays and performs pretty well, even on PS4, base PS4, and I really don't have too much else to say about it because there's not really a ton to talk about with platforming games. However, what I would say is that if you were looking for bang for your buck, long-lasting challenge, and something that's fun, I would definitely recommend Crash Bandicoot 4 It's About Time. Now, what would I give Crash Bandicoot 4 It's About Time? Well, I would give it a 91 out of 100. I think it's a very enjoyable game. I think it has a lot to it, and if you really want to play more and more of it, I think that it's very enjoyable and will definitely provide you with hours upon hours of challenge and content to do stuff with. Now, that said, I would say that the difficulty might dissuade some people. Maybe there could have been a couple extra levels. I don't think they're adding any DLC to it, and it is just a very good thing to see. Not only was the Reignited trilogy very well done, but also Toys for Bob can make new games as well, which I think is really, really good. And ultimately, I'm really excited to see what they do next. Hopefully something Spyro related. I don't think they had anything to do with the Crash nitro-fueled racing. But yeah, I thoroughly enjoyed it. So that's going to be it for this episode of The Verdict. I'm Spraying Pro 1000. I will see you on the next one.